right, and we're back with another lesson on the law. This one is titled God is One, Laws of Exclusivity. And while I was working on this lesson, I was trying to incorporate two ideas there with that title. That God is one, that there is no other God but Him, and also because of that there is only one God, that means there are exclusive rights, in a sense, to Him and how we should worship Him. And so He deserves special devotion because there's only one God. And of course, if you've been listening to the past few weeks, we've been going through the law, and the Israelites have been, they just got out of Egypt, and God's laying down the foundation, in a sense, for the law. And so we'll be starting off looking at the 10 Commandments. I know last week, and I think the week before, we were discussing that there's 613 laws, and that might have scared a few people listening. That, are we really going to go through every single law? And no, we're not. I do not have enough time to work on those. It would take me forever to get through every law. So it'd be kind of like the last few weeks, that only a few laws that we'll be going through, but now we're going to try and correlate them to the 10 Commandments that you see here. We'll break them down, and the other thing you'll find out that a lot of laws actually will overlap into maybe multiple areas. Like today's lesson, you could probably put a couple of them in the second, maybe even third commandment categories you see there. And you might be asking also, what about the ceremonial laws? What about that? Well, we'll get around to them too, but you'll see how I'll approach them. But as you can see right here, these are the 10 Commandments, and the first one we'll be going through is, thou shalt have no other gods before me. And if you've forgotten the rest of the 10 Commandments there, you can look at them and read them, But we'll be moving on. So in Exodus, that's where we got the first commandment given. And it says, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. That's what God is saying. He's laying the foundation to the Israelites, who came out of a very pagan society, who worshipped many other gods. And that's why when we saw the 10 plagues on the Egyptians, those were directed at the different gods that they worshipped. So with this, God's just saying, no, there's only one God, and that's me, and you need to worship me. And so when I was kind of preparing this lesson also, I was thinking that, there's a lot of people who actually believe that all religions are the same in a sense. And I've talked to some people like that believe that all religions are the same and that we're just worshiping the same God, maybe in different countries and different places in slightly different ways. But that's not true, because each religion is vastly different. There is major differences, even on the things that they are somewhat similar on, such as like murdering, don't murder. Christianity handles it in one way, but like Buddhists, as in one of my classes I took in college, they discussed that if you're like a really devoted Buddhist, like monk, they would say all killing is wrong, including insects. And so, they would feel bad stepping on some bugs. And it's like, okay, that's pretty extreme. So even in something like that, they're very different. But I kind of wanted to go even more so on just kind of going over a little bit of the differences of just the whole concept of their God and how they view God. And so Buddhism doesn't quite have a God. They kind of believe in this, it's called like Brahma, I think, as I recall, but they kind of believe in Buddha, but a Buddha is more of a perfect person, or a person who's reached enlightenment. And so they do kind of offer food to those Buddhas, or they do kind of give offerings, and they kind of have certain meanings to it, but they don't quite believe in a creator God, not like we believe in a God. So there's a pretty distinction there. Another one is Hinduism, which this is actually taken from Wikipedia, that it says is a diverse system of thought with beliefs spanning monotheism, polytheism, pantheism, and atheism. And so Hinduism is very prevalent in India, but it is kind of whatever you want it to be. It's pick your poison, in a sense. You want to believe one God? Well, pick the one you like, and then you worship it. Or maybe you want two, you want three, pick as many, or maybe don't want any of them. But somehow you're still Hinduism, or a Hinduist, I mean. So that is quite crazy that there's such a distinction there, that you could have one, many, or none. Another example of a religion that's very different is Jainism. Very small. Not too many people actually believe in this, but it is also in India, and they're polytheism and pantheism. So that is, you believe in many gods out there, but also pantheism, that you believe that God is kind of within everything. And I was watching a video on it, and they were saying also, in a sense, that you are a god, that you will become a god later as you're working out yourself. And I was like, wow, okay, that's pretty interesting. And then lastly is Rastafarianism. I'm not sure if anyone's really heard of this one, but it was very popular a while ago, I guess you could say, or is more well known because of Bob Marley. He's kind of one of the well-known people who was a Rastafarianism. And as I was looking into that religion, it is similar in one sense, because it's monotheistic in belief in a single God referred to as Jah, who partially resides within each individual. Now, when I was researching this too, it's basically an Afro religion, in a sense, more in Jamaica, and they were like, in parentheses, like Black Jesus. So they take things from Christianity and then basically melded it with the society of Jamaica and other African countries, in a sense. And so there's a lot of different things there. And it was very unique as I was kind of looking into that. So kind of with that, how could, if all religions are the same and we're worshiping the same God, how is that possible, though? That's the question here, is when each religion is vastly different. Buddhism don't really believe in a god. They believe in Buddhas. Hinduism could be anything. Jainism, you're kind of a god eventually, maybe. And Rastafarianism, you kind of believe in a single god. So it's like, if I believe in one god and you believe in no god, or maybe three gods, which god is being worshipped? So obviously a logical error is being created there. It's not possible to be worshiping the same god. So, but we'll get back to that. But for now, we're actually going to start looking at the law. And we'll just start going through different ones, as like we do. And we'll try and get to the principle, mainly, and how it applies to us. So with the first one is Deuteronomy 12. When you drive out the nations that live there, you must destroy all the places where they worship their gods, high on the mountains, up on the hills, and under every green tree. Break down their altars and smash their sacred pillars. Burn their Asherah poles and cut down their carved idols. Completely erase the name of their gods. Do not worship the Lord your God in the way that these pagan worshippers worship their gods. So you see that the Israelites, so this is before. So before they've come into the promised land, God is giving a decree saying, when you get to the promised land, destroy any pagan worship temple, pagan worship practice kind of things that they would use, like, the Asherah poles and all these other pillars, idols that are set up in the, cities and whatnot. Go in, destroy it. And it says, don't worship like them. And later in the chapter, towards the end, it kind of similarly says the same thing, which says, do not fall into the trap of following their customs and worshiping their gods. Do not inquire about their gods, saying, how do the nations worship their gods? I want to follow their example. You must not worship the Lord your God the way the other nations worship their gods. So it's really clear here. God is saying, don't go into a different country, the promised land specifically for them, And think about, how do they worship their God? That's an interesting way they worship. Maybe I'll start trying that. No, God is very clear. He's saying, don't worship me like everyone else worships their God. So the principle, you could say, is do not mix religions. You're a Christian, Don't try and mix Buddhism into that. Be Christian and Christian only. And so how is that affecting the love aspect? You don't want to show a bad example. And also in this, you're kind of showing the destruction side. You're kind of destroying the other things. And so it's showing love so that you're not allowing others to fall into the temptation. Now, actually, the early church, New Testament church, struggled with this. And they kind of, you could say even we struggle with this today in other respects. But early on, the Romans, when they converted to Christianity, they wanted to bring their pagan worship practices with them. And you see that with kind of how the Catholic Church did start to incorporate imagery and I guess you could say idols in our respect, but statues of God or statues of saints or whatnot. And so there was a debate early on known as the iconoclasm debate, whether we use images and statues of God or people in our worship to help and aid us when we worship. And that's where we split, in a sense. There is the Catholic Church that says, yeah, let's keep some of this. We like to have our art, quote unquote art, to help us worship God. And the Protestants were like, no, that's pretty clear. We shouldn't do that. It's in the Ten Commandments, don't make a graven image. And so as you can see, this can be dual. As I said before, some of these rules could apply to the first and second commandment. But so you see there was a split there. And that was the Catholic Church. They split and we decided no. And that's why when you look at the churches around, Baptist churches and the other churches like those, you don't see much pictures of Jesus. You don't see any statues anywhere. And so there's definitely a different distinction there. And so with that, so the principle we're trying to get to is do not allow pagan practices into your life or mixing of them via religion. Shouldn't be mixing religious. Or even, you don't want to incorporate the pagan practices into your just daily lives that we could maybe by accidentally be doing that maybe in today's society we don't realize are religious ceremonial religious practices. Because you could also say don't incorporate them into your life, because that's also kind of a sense of worldliness, not only just incorporating pagan worship practices. So I kind of wanted to look at a list that I was coming up with, not even an exhaustive list, but these are just the ones that I was thinking about as working on this lesson. The first one is pagan meditation. A lot of times people say, it's good and healthy to meditate to avoid stress. And, yes, meditation is good, obviously, if it's done right. But the way that most people think about meditation is the kind of, you could say, the pagan example of kind of more Buddhism or Hinduism that is all about emptying yourself out, going to that nothingness state, which is part of their religion. You're trying to become nothing almost. But if you look at the Hebrew definition of meditation, it is more translated to chewing. So when you chew, you're kind of chewing on it, and the example is you think about a verse, and you think about the verse the entire day. And as you're doing that, you're processing it, you're thinking about it, and you're trying to understand it. So instead of becoming mindless, you're kind of becoming mindful. And so that's the difference between pagan meditation and more Christian meditation, that you're actually trying to think and meditate and gain wisdom. But pagan is just nothingness, and that's kind of what's the point of that. Like, I kind of understand, it's like, be quiet and kind of get to that silence. Sure, that we could all use some quiet time in a sense, but that's still not the pagan meditation we should be doing, though. And this kind of also partly is yoga. I was actually looking into it, and I didn't even realize how religious yoga was. I knew that in certain classes they'll like start talking about certain things. If you take a yoga class, they'll like, oh, dig deep, kind of connect with your spirit or the universe, and they'll start saying certain things. But actually, there's books out there that will give you like what each pose means and in what way. It's pretty crazy. It was pretty interesting just looking that up. And that kind of brings up the debate: is should you really be doing yoga if you're a Christian? And I would say the simple answer is, yeah, no, you shouldn't. You could probably stretch in another different way. And actually, a lot of those yoga poses I don't even think are that helpful. A lot of them are just kind of weird. So if you're really just looking for a good stretch, just stretch, normally, not via yoga. Another one that is very pagan is karma. That is part of Hinduism. And I always feel sad when other Christians start talking about karma. And I'm like, dude, well, we don't believe in karma. What are you talking about karma? And so it's like, don't you know what we believe? So that's another practice that if you really honestly think there is karma, you should probably realize the Bible does not support that. Now, another one is weed or drugs, and that is actually always kind of been very pagan religious aspect, and it was very, in the Old Testament, it was pretty much paired always with witchcraft, and because how it was is you'd go to a witchcraft or a person who does wizardry, and they would create a concoction of a potion or whatnot, and you drink it, and you think you're having magic done, but you're actually just tripping. You're just high on weed or other drugs, and God didn't want that. And actually, other religions do incorporate drugs and weed into their religious ceremonies because they think, oh, it helps you, connect to God. And actually, that's kind of one of the reasons why I brought up the Rastafarianism, because that's why Bob Marley, also kind of known for weed, part of their worship services, in a sense, was to kind of get high on weed and marijuana. That was very prevalent, and they would say even just eat it straight, So that was very interesting. And so whether you're doing that in your normal life or trying to do that while you're worshiping God, both are definitely things you do not want to incorporate into your life and try to stop if you are. Now, another one that people don't really think about that is pagan is tattoos. Very specifically also henna tattoos. Those are Hindu. And they are little designs, and they kind of have meanings behind them. They look neat, and a lot of things do. Sin always is enticing, but just because it is enticing doesn't mean we should. Now, there are tattoos. I was looking into the Egyptian culture, that they also kind of incorporated those into certain religious aspects, and there's other religions also that kind of have tattoos as it. And this is another one that I feel bad when I hear a Christian say, oh, I'm going to get a tattoo. A lot of times they'll say, oh, I'm only going to get one, which also, give it a couple years, never is true. I always see them end up with a couple more. But they say, oh, I'm only going to get one, and this one is going to be a cross, or it'll be a verse, it'll be a Christian tattoo. And what tends to happen is they get that, and then later they're like, oh, I got a tattoo. It wasn't that bad. I'll get another one. This one not Christian in a sense. But at the same time, saying it's Christian or making a Christian image of a tattoo doesn't make it Christian. These are pagan practices in pagan worship, in one sense. And so with this, even though there are verses that literally say in Leviticus, just don't get a tattoo, another reason why one shouldn't get a tattoo is it's from kind of more pagan religious ceremonies and other things like that. And so God says, don't worship me like that. I don't want to be worshipped like the rest of the world. I've told you how I want to be worshipped. Don't do the things that other cultures are doing. Now, another one is a dream catcher. I know a lot of people will say, oh, it looks cool, and I just kind of hang it on my car or maybe in my wall. But it's like, sure, it might be interesting to look at, but what does that say? You're kind of, this is Native American or Indian religious kind of thing, you could say. And I always feel uncomfortable when I see them in people's houses. I'm like, oh man, what does that incorporate? But then if you have someone who's not a Christian over at your house and they see that, they're like, oh, are you Christian? Or like, what's that? Tell me about that. And I'm like, oh no, it's just art. And you just have to explain things away of like why you have it. It's just easier not to have it. Why do you want to put a bad example in your house? It's like, is a Christian, do you want to have Buddha all over your house because they're, for some reason, maybe you like the design? No, you wouldn't have that in your house. And so in the same way, you probably shouldn't have a dream catcher in your house. And lastly, palm reading. This isn't necessarily a religious ceremony. I would just kind of call it swindling. But it is still kind of, you could say, a power outside of God that, people are saying there is. And you're kind of just playing with fire there, obviously. You're either just talking with a swindler who's making things up, or maybe you could be talking to a demon, in a sense. Could happen. And I'd really just recommend, don't waste your time with that. That's not necessarily religious, but that's just something you shouldn't add to your life. Now, at the same time, so this is not an exhaustive list. These are just the ones that came to mind as I was preparing this list. But we shouldn't go in the opposite sense, that we look at another religion and we see that, oh, they read from a book. We should stop reading from our Bible. No. That's not how it works. We just look at what God said, how us to worshiping him, and then we do that. Things that they worship that we don't do, then sure, we can look at that and see how they worship, and we make sure not to do that, in a sense, if that makes any sense. And so that's the thing. We don't want to mix religions, in a sense. We worship God the way he's told us to, and we also don't really want to just incorporate those things into our lives to begin with either. So moving on to another law, though, in Deuteronomy 13, if you hear someone in your cities, which the Lord your God gives you to dwell in, saying, corrupt men have gone out from among you, and enticed the inhabitants of the city, saying, let us go and serve other gods, which you have not known. When you shall inquire, search out, and ask diligently, and if it is indeed true and certain that such an abomination was committed among you, you shall surely strike the inhabitants of the city with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying it, all that is in and its livestock, with the edge of the sword. And you shall gather all its plunder into the middle of the streets, and completely burn with fire in city and its plunder for the Lord your God. It shall be a heap forever. It shall not be built again. So none of the accursed things shall remain in your hand, that the Lord may turn from the fierceness of his anger and show you mercy. Have compassion on you and multiply you, just as he swore to your fathers, because you have listened to the voice of the Lord your God, to keep all his commandments, which I command to you today. A lot to take in there. But the main thing to look at is kind of the destruction of the stuff that was kind of pagan, you could say, the worship stuff. And you see that it was also temptation there, and says that you don't want that temptation there. You don't want to take that chance. And so you're thinking, how do we apply this? Do we just go around destroying things? Well, not exactly. In the New Testament, we do see something similar. In Acts, it does say this: and many who had believed came confessing and telling their deeds. Also many of those who had practiced magic brought their books together and burned them in the sight of all. And they counted up value of them, and it totaled 50,000 pieces of silver. So the word of the Lord grew mighty and prevailed. So there's a few things you want to look at there. Is you see in the culture they're converting, and it looks like they must have been dabbling in witchcraft or magic of some sort, and they had sorcery books on hand. And what they could have done, you could have saying, is they became Christian, and maybe they should have just put it on their their bookshelves, and maybe they'd look back at it at times and maybe practice a few chants, show their friends when they come over, like, oh yeah, I used to be from this religion. Here, look, this is the thing I used to look at and use as source, But no, that's not what they did. They don't want that. They don't want to take a chance of them falling back into that. So what they did is they destroyed it. They burned it, and in the sight of everyone as a statement, they're saying, no, we're no longer, witches. We're no longer magicians in a sense. We're Christians. We're going to burn this. Everyone saw it because, they're in the center of the town, it looks like almost. And then also it says how much it cost. That's an interesting. Why did they bring up how much it cost? Well, that's because many of them might have been thinking, oh, okay, I'm going to become Christian, but let me sell these books, because books were hard to come by and they were very expensive. And so someone could have made money. But that's another thing that is amazing there. They're like, okay, I don't want anyone to fall prey to this and fall into the same temptation and sin, so I'm going to destroy it. Even though I could have made money, that's not important. What matters is the lives of others and them falling into sinful ways. And so if you destroy it, better that no one has it. And this is the same approach I take when Jehovah's Witness or Mormons come door to door and they say, oh, would you like a pamphlet, to look at and read over? I'm like, of course I would. And then in the next second after I close the door, I will rip it up and throw it away. So that just one less maybe, that someone else will not get a pamphlet. It'd be kind of nice to be like, oh, I want a pamphlet. I'd be like, yes, can I have your whole stack? I will pass them out myself to my personal garbage, bin. But I don't think they would actually give me all of them. It would be nice though, so I could get rid of them, saving others. So that's the thing. We're not even, if you've changed from a sinful way, and you've got certain things, get rid of it. And that's the thing. That's the principle that we need to get to there. Destroy the access you have to your previous or current, if you are living in certain sins or pagan styles of lifestyle. It's easier to just destroy it than to keep it around, because you know what? You're going to go back to it. You're going to get some. And that's the problem. Makes it, the easier it is to get to, the easier it is to fall prey to it. Moving on to another verse in Deuteronomy is, if there arises among you a prophet and a dreamer of dreams, and he gives you a sign or wonder, and the signs of the wonder comes to pass of which he spoke to you, saying, let us go after other gods, which you have not known, and let us serve them. You shall not listen to the words of the prophet or that dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. You shall walk after the Lord your God and fear him and keep his commandments and obey his voice. You shall serve him and hold fast to him. So this law is saying, okay, someone has a dream, some prophet, he's saying, okay, and this dream told me, let's go change religions. Let's start worshiping another god. And you're supposed to just say, no, I'm not going to have that. We are not going to change religions because you had a dream that said maybe you should. Because in this situation, God said it was a test. God says, we'll see if you do. If you did change, then obviously you don't love God in a sense. And so it's a test. And how do we apply that though into the New Testament? We do see some very interesting aspects brought up. In 2 John, how they approach it, or he approaches it, is whoever transgresses and does not abide in the doctrine of Christ does not have God. He who abides in the doctrine of Christ has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this doctrine, do not receive him into your house, nor greet him. For he who greets him shares in his evil deeds. That's pretty harsh, it seems. There's actually another one that kind of even says about the same thing, which says in Romans, now I urge you, brethren, not those who cause divisions and offense contrary to the doctrine which you've learned, and avoid them. For those who are such do not serve our Lord Jesus Christ, but their own belly, and by smooth words and flattering speech deceives the hearts of the simple. So you might be thinking a few things there now. So it gave two examples in a sense. Avoid those who have division, don't believe in the doctrine of Christ, and so they're giving that. And so, kind of is that similar temptation of trying to believe heresy or other religions in a sense. As you can kind of see, the Rastafarianism was kind of a mold or a mixture of Christianity and kind of paganism. You don't want to join in on that. And this is saying avoid them. The other one says don't even let them go in your house, greet them in a sense. Pretty crazy in what we're used to, accustomed today, because we're just like, oh, we're all the same. Let's just be friends. And that's a problem in one sense that, our society does say just be friends with everyone. And a lot of people also say, well, Jesus, he was friends, right? He ate with the sinners and the harlots and whatnot. But the thing that's unique there is, one, he actually kind of just kept the 12 disciples close to him. It doesn't really seem too much that he kept too many other friends around him. And every time he did kind of go out with any sinners or whatnot, what was his purpose? His purpose was to save them. He was presenting the gospel. And a lot of them did convert. And the others, they went away. So there is a distinction there. And so that's a hard part, is don't try and, I guess you could say, be friends too much with non-Christians, you could say. The church actually used to be very more tight-knit, that they'd be like, oh, you're not Christian, I'm not really be your friend. Now, that is not to say we shouldn't be friendly. We need to be friendly to everyone. That's what the Bible teaches. We need to be friendly to everyone. But it doesn't say we need to be friends with everyone. Because when you're friends with them, what are friends? You get advice from them. You have a good time with them. And the thing is, the way that Christians have a good time and give advice are very different than non-religious people, in a sense. They will give you bad advice and maybe take you down the wrong road for how to party, So that's the problem. It's a lot easier to be taken down than it is to be helped up, especially when the person is lower, in a sense, in understanding the Bible. I would be very surprised if a non-religious person gave you religious advice, in a sense. And I kind of equate friendship salvation or witnessing to the same way that people approach dating salvation or witnessing. It's like, oh, I'm just going to date them. I know they're not Christian now, but give me a few years. I will work on that. But what happens, I've actually never seen anyone be converted yet, but I've always seen broken up relationships, and ones that don't end up having very difficult homes. Because then one person isn't a Christian, the other person is. What happens with the kids? Then both of them are trying to indoctrinate their kids of saying, oh, no, there is a God, and the other one saying, no, there isn't a God. And so there's a war of whether to bring them to church or not, and it just becomes a house of division. And why do that, And so I know it's very difficult, but our goal should be presenting the gospel, because we also don't see friendship witnessing in the New Testament really at all either. We see Paul going from place to place and just presenting gospel. He went to the different temples, in a sense, and says, hey, what God do you believe in? Oh, this unknown God? Oh, okay. What about that one? Okay. And then he went and talked about the supposed unknown God, in a sense, to get into that. And then talked about the real God. And he didn't say, oh, look, but wait, I need to become your first. Let's go out to get some coffee. Let's go play some games. Let's party a little bit before I talk to you about Jesus. No, if you do that, you're just procrastinating, and it's going to be very difficult. And that's the thing, is that how we approach gospel and witnessing is vastly different to how people approached it in the Bible and people approached it in the New Testament. It was very more about witnessing and just going around and talking to people, just say, oh, hey, do you believe in God? Yeah? No? Okay. Well, let's tell me about that. And you just kind of work on that. And not all of us have ever done that, but it's definitely a good experience to try. And obviously, if you have some friends that aren't saved, you should be working on that. You don't have to just be like, oh, I can't hang out with you. No, you probably work on trying to present the gospel on them a little bit more intensely. because that's our purpose in life, is to present the gospel to non-Christians. In a sense, they need to hear Jesus, the name of Jesus, and believe in him. So that is to say, also, do not listen to or entertain false gods or heresies. Those are the principles here that we're getting from those laws, and the New Testament application we see. And I also kind of say that even when you're out and about and you hear certain false doctrines, try and correct them if you're bold enough. I know there was a certain situation that I was waiting in line to get my hair cut, and someone, I think he said he was Christian, talking to someone else, I think, who was Buddhist, and he was saying, oh yeah, I believe in Jesus or God, and but we all kind of believe the same God, right? And he started talking about certain other things, and the Islam kind of sees it as this, that, the Bible's corrupted, and I think they have some points. It's many thousands of years old, and I just started like, okay, hold on, I need to jump into the conversation. No, Jesus says there's one way to get to heaven, and that's through him. And after that, he did not have that. We had a good old time, but I did see that one of the other persons who was kind of also couldn't help but listen, she looked like she was like, okay, cool. Someone decided to step up, because she seemed like she kind of agreed on my side. But it's definitely, and the thing is, you're not doing this out of like, oh, I'm right, you're wrong. No, it's so that they hear the true gospel. You don't want them to go to hell. You want them to be saved. So it's okay to correct people in that sense, in a loving manner, of course. And so yeah, don't listen to false gods or heresies. Just kind of ignore it, or as I said, correct it when you can. That's kind of how you should approach it. Moving on to our last example, trying to finish up, is another in Deuteronomy. It says, but if there is a defect in it, if it is lame or blind or has any serious defects, you shall not sacrifice it to the Lord your God. All right, so we got our ceremonial law, sacrifices. And you're like, well, I thought Jesus was the end of sacrifices. Why do I need to think about this law? And you're like, okay, you kind of have a point. Jesus is the final sacrifice. But there is more to be held here, that is the Romans passage. It says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. So instead of just throwing out the law of, bringing a perfect sacrifice, because that's how the sacrifices were, you're supposed to bring your best. And now Jesus was the final sacrifice, but also you are the sacrifice in a sense, but a living sacrifice. So another example, though, back in the law is in Leviticus. It says, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron, saying, no man of your descendants in succeeding generations who has any defect may approach to offer the bread of his God. For any man who has a defect shall not approach a man blind or lame, or who has marred face or limb too long, a man who has broken foot, a broken hand, hunchback or dwarf, a man who has a defect in his eye, eczema or scab, or is a eunuch. No man, descendants of Aaron, the priests, who has any defect shall come near to offer the offerings made by fire to the Lord. He has a defect. He shall not come near to offer the bread of his God. He may eat the bread of his father or his God, but the most holy and the holy, only he shall not go near the veil or approach the altar, because he has a defect, lest he profane my sanctuary. For I am the Lord, sanctify them. For I, the Lord, sanctify them. So another law, kind of similar as other ones, how do you approach? This is saying the priests. We don't quite got priests today. We got pastors and teachers. But this one is saying, okay, don't, let him offer the bread in a certain way. But he does make a point to say, yeah, he can eat it. He can, worship God. Obviously, he still has access to God. And he encourages that. But he says in certain things, since he is, has defects in a sense, you could say, God wants the best. and so he isn't able to do certain things within the tabernacle. And so how do we apply this? Do we say, oh, certain people can't become pastors or teachers? Well, let's look at a New Testament. How do they approach it? And in Timothy, they say, this is a faithful saying. If a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. So it's good to become a teacher. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetousness. One who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, not lest he be puffed up with pride, he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. Moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside, lest he fall into the reproach and the snare of the devil. So we kind of see the New Testament approach. This is the spirit of the law. There was physical defects with the Old Testament. Or he's like, okay, God wants perfect, nothing damage, no damaged good. But now in the New Testament it says spiritual defects. Don't have certain blaring sins that a teacher is suffering or struggling with and promote them to leadership. No, you should try and find the best of the best to be a teacher for many reasons. But also it says, to not bring shame, almost in a sense. Don't mar the name of God, because look, there's churches out there that have promoted someone maybe a bit too soon who are struggling in certain areas, and what happens? Non-religious people will point out, it's like, oh, look, that person's an adulterer. Oh, that person's cussing or swearing, or this person's doing this or that. And what does that do? It brings hypocrisy into the church, and it just brings down God's name in a sense. Like, oh, why would we go believe in that when they can't even follow the rules themselves? So we do want someone who is abiding by the rules, at least to certain obvious ones. Obviously, we all have things to work on, but there are some bigger ones that are a bit more prevalent that people will see real quick if you are not following. Like if you're quarrelsome, you're always getting in fights. It's like that doesn't, you want to work on that if you're very hot-tempered. And so we see that with that law, the original, with the ceremonial laws of, presenting sacrifices to God and being a priest has certain roles, and it says don't promote those with spiritual defects in a sense. God wants the best of the best, and we should give him the best of the best when we have it, So that's kind of the end. Kind of wrap up. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. That's the law. That's the first covenant. And as I said before, we will find many laws in the Old Testament that do fall into that category. And I only showed you a few today. But if you go through it, you could think about the law that you read, and you could probably find many, many more. I just don't really have time to look at every single law. But to kind of wrap up, Matthew 22, it says, Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And so there's one God, and he has exclusive rights to you, in a sense, and how you worship, the way you think, how we present ourselves to God, and interact with others. There are different ways to interact. And so with that, we should have a changed life and everything. The way the way God is, the way we are, we need to change, to mirror God. All right. And so that wraps up this week's lesson. See you next week.